You ready? 1, 2, 3.
The digital game that I wish to critique is called The Last of Us. It is an action-adventure survival horror video game developed by Naughty Dog. You play through the eyes of Joel, a smuggler surviving in a post-apocalyptic world which has been overrun by the infected. The infected are mutated humans similar to zombies who try and kill or infect any humans. The main goal of the game is to escort a 14-year-old girl named Ellie thousands of miles across a barren land which was once the United States of America. The game is centralized around the relationship between the two main protagonists, Ellie and Joel. You follow them on a journey and see their relationship evolve throughout the game. Through various techniques, the player must fight their way through hundreds of infected and hostile humans to try and reach the outcome of the game. The first part of this critique, I will be analysing the game in relation to these formal elements. Formal elements are what make games different to other forms of media, whilst also providing a structure in which the game is laid out in. The formal elements are players, objectives, rules, procedures, resources, conflict, boundaries, and outcomes. The formal element players help to define how a player interacts with the game. These include single player, one-on-one, team versus team, cooperative, etc. The Last of Us is a predominantly single player game, however there is also a multiplayer online portion as well. If the player decides to play the story mode, therefore they would be entering a single player environment where they interact with AI as opposed to other people. If, however, they decide to play online, they can go on various game modes against other real people. These modes include team versus team and free for all. The objective of the game is what the player is trying to achieve or complete. When they achieve this, the game has been beat or completed. The main objective types are capture, chase, race, alignment, rescue or escape, forbidden act, exploration, construction, outwit, and solution. Like with many games, I believe that The Last of Us fits into more than one category. The main objective, however, is to finish the narrative. That is the only way you can complete or beat the game. However, to achieve this main objective, the player must kill opponents, explore the levels for supplies, and keep Ellie safe. This last point can be debatable though, as Ellie cannot actually be killed by the enemies nor is she noticed by them. Therefore, if you fail to protect her, this will not stop you from achieving the main objective, which is finishing the narrative of the game. The rules in a game serve multiple purposes. The first purpose is to define the objects that can be or are in a game. Another purpose is that it defines the actions that a player can take or do within the game environment. An example of a rule could be, if the health of a player reaches 0, they die and are reset to the last checkpoint they reached in the game.
But it's too late.
I think that The Last of Us makes good use of the rules that help keep the game challenging throughout its entirety. An example of this is the workbench in the game where players can upgrade their weapons. In order to upgrade your weapon, the rules is that you need a required number of scrap to do so. Every time you do upgrade, the scrap is taken off you. It is these simple rules that prevent players from upgrading their weapons too early and becoming unbalanced with the rest of the game. This keeps the game challenging and more enjoyable as your character won't be overpowered in relation to the enemies. The procedures in a game are the actions that a player takes which are dictated by the rules. To achieve the objective of the game, the player must follow these procedures, which include methods of play and the actions they can take. An example of a procedure in The Last of Us which helps you complete the main objective would be picking up ammunition for your weapon. There are many rules running in the background of the program to determine whether you already have ammunition or not. The current rule may state that you have no ammunition, which means you cannot fire your weapon. Picking up ammunition is the procedure that the player now takes to gain ammunition, so that the rules state you can fire the weapon. This would allow the player to more easily kill or capture their opponents in the game and thus help them obtain their main objective on completing the narrative. The resources in a game can be defined as any element that has value to the player. Examples of resources include lives, units, health, currency, actions, power-ups, inventory, special terrain, and time. For something to be a resource, it needs two very important attributes. These are utility and scarcity. The resource needs to be of use to achieve something, otherwise it is useless. The same can be said for scarcity. If there are too many of the same resource in a game, it becomes less valuable. The main resources that I believe to be most important in The Last of Us are health, inventory, and actions. Health, of course, is very important as it determines if you live or die. You need health to be able to survive encounters with enemies and hence progress in the game. Health can be healed via health kits or cans of food found throughout the game environment. However, it doesn't matter how many times you die as you always return to your last checkpoint. Depending on the difficulty you have chosen, health may not even regenerate when you finish the level of the game. This increases its scarcity and value to the player. The inventory in this game is essential to your survival and success in achieving your objectives. Inventory includes scrap metal, pills, weapons, ammo, and other materials. Scrap metal allows you to upgrade your weapons, whilst the pills allow you to improve Joel as a character. This will increase the power of both your weapons and Joel, which will be very advantageous against enemies. Of course, you can choose not to use any ammunition and try and melee all your enemies. But this will not work. One enemy type in The Last of Us called a clicker cannot be defeated solely via hand-to-hand combat. The player requires either guns or other melee weapons to defeat this character. On harder difficulty settings, this forces the player to save ammunition and increases its scarcity and value. The last resource I would like to discuss are the actions you can take when you have the correct combination of inventory items. In The Last of Us, you can create extra items by collecting individual items. For example, if you collect tape, scissors and a pipe, you can create a weapon that kills enemies in one hit. Therefore, when this weapon has been crafted, it allows the players to perform an action they otherwise wouldn't be able to do. This gives it scarcity, value and utility. Another example is you can create a shiv using scissors and tape. This can give you access to rooms that you wouldn't otherwise be able to gain access to. In these rooms, there are plenty of useful items such as ammunition and health. All of these will help the player complete their objective. The conflict in games is essentially anything that tries to prevent the players from achieving their objectives or goals. As there is conflict, this means that the player has to solve these problems within certain restraints defined by the game's rules and procedures. This is what helps to create challenge. There are three main types of conflict in which are all present in The Last of Us. These are obstacles, opponents, and dilemmas. One example of a physical obstacle within The Last of Us would be the fact that Ellie cannot swim. This means that when the character comes in contact with water, they must find a solution to get Ellie across the water, otherwise they will be unable to progress. This conflict is usually solved by the use of a pallet which Joel pushes for Ellie while she stands on it. Once this has been solved, the player can continue progressing towards their goal. Perhaps the most obvious conflict in The Last of Us is the opponents or enemies. They are scattered throughout nearly every level in the game to serve one purpose, trying to kill or infect your character. This means that the player has to safely navigate through all these opponents to successfully complete their goals. Though the player can sneak past some of the enemies, open combat is always inevitable.
Jeez.
Not only can this get the player killed and stop their progression, it can drain their resources and make the game more difficult. Two sources of a dilemma within The Last of Us I believe include weapon usage and upgradability. Weapon usage is especially important on the highest difficulty. This is due to the scarcity of bullets and the toughness of the enemies themselves. To save ammunition, the player may choose to use hand-to-hand weapons only and to only use guns on the toughest enemies. They also may be more strategic with their use of weapons. For example, here I wait for the enemies to group together before I throw the Molotov.
Come on, go!
Another series of choices the player has is how to upgrade their character. The dilemma they have is what to upgrade first or the most. This will affect how their character performs in the game in regards to overall health, weapon skill, and other useful traits. Once they have chosen what to upgrade, they cannot go back. The boundaries within a game can be both physical and conceptual. It is a question between where does the game end and reality begin. Though some boundaries can be very loose, such as playing tag, and some can be very strict, such as the dimensions of a football pitch, I believe that The Last of Us has fairly rigid boundaries. The Last of Us is a very linear game, which means the player must go from one point to another to either achieve their objective or to reach a checkpoint. This means that the boundaries need to be quite obvious and to a point restrictive so that the player cannot get lost or confused. If there were no boundaries within The Last of Us, it would change the dynamic of the game significantly. For example, take a look at this level in the sewers in the game. Enemies could be hiding around any corner. If these boundaries were not there, it would make the game much easier and it would lose its horror survival appeal as the player may feel as if they are not in danger. It is the small confined spaces in this level that produce the best player experiences with a brilliant balance between difficulty and skill level. Of course, if the sewer walls were hundreds of feet apart, the game's difficulty would become trivial. As the title suggests, the outcome of a game is how it ends. To help an outcome be successful, there needs to be an element of uncertainty. If the ending is too obvious or apparent, the game will lose its appeal and the player may no longer wish to play. Throughout The Last of Us, you are trying to smuggle a girl, Ellie, to a militia group called the Fireflies. There are 2 instances in the game where it seems you have achieved this objective, but are dismayed to find out that it was a false alarm, as everyone had been killed before you got there. By doing this, the game is keeping the player on the edge of their seat, and thus giving them extra incentive to keep on playing. It is the feeling of not knowing that The Last of Us excels in. Though at the very end of the game you finally find the Fireflies, something quite unexpected and surprising occurs. It is this turn of events that make the outcome of the game very rewarding to the player and incentivizes new potential players to play the game. I am not willing to reveal the ending of the game, so you just have to play it yourself. Now we've looked at the formal elements, I will now move on to the dramatic elements in The Last of Us. The dramatic elements in a game give the gameplay context and help to emotionally engage a player with the game experience. In other words, the dramatic elements are associated with your feelings and emotions experienced whilst playing a game. The 7 dramatic elements are challenge, play, premise, character, story, world building, and the dramatic arc. I believe that The Last of Us has very good use of challenge. Not only does the game have multiple difficulties ranging from easy to grounded, but the gameplay also evolves from the beginning of the game all the way to the end. This means that it appeals to players from beginner to expert levels of skill. For example, near the climax of the game there are multiple bloaters in one place. These are the hardest of the enemies that can challenge even the most skilled players of the game. In addition to this, the player may feel a big sense of achievement for protecting Ellie, as by the end of the game, players tend to have an emotional attachment with this character. The play within a game relates to the freedom that players have to act within the possible restraints of the rules and procedures. I think perhaps that this is an element that The Last of Us doesn't fully explore. Of course, there are elements of play within this game. Perhaps the most obvious is that it's entirely up to the player how they kill an enemy. They could go in guns blazing or take a sneaky approach similar to that of Splinter Cell. However, aside from this, the player's freedom is fairly restricted. At the end of the day, they always have to progress by killing enemies. The players that I think will enjoy this game the most include the competitor, the collector, the artist, and the storyteller. This isn't to say, however, the other players will not enjoy this game. With the exception of small kids, I think everyone would love this game. The premise is what establishes the setting or environment that a game is played in. Without premise, the game would be too abstract and out of context for players to become emotionally invested. The prologue of The Last of Us does a brilliant job of setting up the environment and the context for the rest of the game. It gives the player first-hand experience as to how the outbreak occurred and why the world turned into a post-apocalyptic setting. This mission also gives valuable backstory about the main protagonist Joel, so the player can become emotionally attached. It is however the second mission that you learn the story behind the whole game. This is where you find out you are responsible for the safety and well-being of a girl named Ellie whilst travelling across the United States searching for the Fireflies. The characters in a game are the mediums through which drama is communicated to the player. This is usually done by the actions the characters take. The character relationships in this game are simply amazing. I think that it is one of the main reasons why I like this game so much. You can feel the relationship between Joel and Ellie evolve as the game progresses. They become more and more open with each other as the relationship gets stronger. The player can't help but feel empathy towards this growing relationship which the characters do and say things people can relate to. As the players feel the emotions the characters are feeling, they become more emotionally invested in their actions, objectives, and finally the possible outcomes of the game. The story in a game is essentially what happens as a result of the gameplay before it. There are 2 main types of story in relation to games. There can be a dynamic structure or predetermined structure. A dynamic structure means that the story is directly related to the gameplay. For example, the choices that a player makes would influence the story outcomes. On the other hand, a predetermined structure means that the story will occur the same way regardless of how the game is played or what the player does. What I think makes the story so good in The Last of Us is that it directly supports our last point, characters. The story gives Joel and Ellie a scenario in which they must battle their way through life and death situations. This is what forces their relationship to evolve and hence force the player to feel empathy towards them. Hence, the story correlates with the characters and helps players emotionally engage with the game as an experience. World building involves the design and construction of a fictional world that could potentially include governments, economies, languages, etc. An example of this would be the World of Warcraft universe. Though The Last of Us does contain a world that includes language, culture, and to a point government and economies, these cannot be affected nor are they determined by the player. Therefore, The Last of Us does not really provide a world-building environment. Though some may think this means there are less features in the game, I still maintain that the game wouldn't be improved by adding world building. This could possibly make the game too complex and complicated. It also wouldn't fit the story since the main characters have to constantly keep progressing, so building economies, etc. would be inefficient and not suit the game. The dramatic arc within a game is how it uses conflict throughout its story to keep the player emotionally involved within the game. Once a conflict has been set in motion, it must escalate in order to create the tension that keeps the player attached. The Last of Us has a classic dramatic arc which climaxes near the end of the game, which is then followed by a fall-in action to release the tension. The dramatic arc for The Last of Us may look something like this. We start off with meeting Ellie where there is little conflict. This conflict starts to rise as the enemies in the game get tougher and other characters die. This is compounded by the uncertainty in the outcome. The arc reaches its climax when you finally find the Fireflies in the game. This is where the plot twist occurs and the most tension is present. This is followed by a small mission where you walk through the woods with Ellie. This is a resolution or closure phase to the game where the player feels a sense of mastery and the most accomplishment. If you haven't already realised, The Last of Us is an amazing game that follows almost perfectly both the formal and dramatic elements in game design. I know that you're not supposed to see good design, but good design is everywhere you look in this game. And of course, thank you all for watching.